The border between the United States and Canada is unique due to its unique history. This film delves into the intriguing world of the US-Canada border, including its intriguing history, ongoing disputes, and peculiarities that contribute to its huge 5,525-mile length. From the islands that both countries claim to the border crossing over lakes. Stay tuned until the very end to see how this intricate boundary came to be and why it matters, even in places that appear to be deserted. Border crossings generally fall into one of two very boring categories, either extremely boring or just plain boring. The inevitable process of traveling from point A to point B can be made somewhat boring by long, seemingly never-ending lines of people and idle cars spewing exhaust fumes. The US-Canada border defies the notion that all border crossings are boring. With a variety of activities and attractions, it can be unique and captivating. It defies the notion of a dull border. Even though their ties are cordial, both nations have taken pains to demarcate their boundaries by erecting a 20-foot wide strip that runs the length of the 5,525-mile border and is known as the no-touching zone. You could assume that there has to be some development, yet there are still differences. Both the United States and Canada claim a number of islands in the Atlantic. On one of them, they even constructed a lighthouse, but it's a bit of a mystery. The border has other strange places as well. It occasionally passes by lakes and splits off a section of land. This occurred as a result of the lack of accurate maps in the past, which forced people to make educated guesses about the border's location. This happened in particular because, let's face it, border marking wasn't very accurate in the 1800s, despite people's best efforts with compasses and strings. In order to indicate the border, more than 900 markers were placed. These markers link the dots for the no-touching area. Those boundary trees will not be permitted to stay, even if this zone occurs to stretch hundreds of miles through remote areas of Alaska or the Yukon. Contrary to what you would think, this is not the longest, straightest length of deforested land on Earth. It's not straight, but it is deforested anyway. Though the treaties require it to be straight, the legal border is really made up of 900 lines that zigzag away from the horizontal by up to several hundred feet. This is why it seems straight on maps. So what led to the creation of this complex border? Imagine yourself in North America during the 1800s. The national boundary has been declared to be the 49th parallel, one of those horizontal lines on the globe, and it is up to you to make it happen. Using just a compass and a ball of string as tools, your job is to mark off the next 2/3 of a continent precisely. Just maintain that line straight, and you won't have to worry about the unknown territory that lies ahead. Good luck with that. The surveyors of the era built nearly 900 monuments, giving it their all. Given the constraints of a pre-GPS civilization, they performed a respectable job. But this is not the kind of intersection that would excite a mathematician searching for a completely spherical or planar border. Nevertheless, the no-touching zone forms a connect-the-dots pattern between these monuments, which define the border. The shape of these two countries is defined by a total of roughly 8,000 markers, of which there are about 900 along this particular stretch of the border. There is still contested area between the United States and Canada despite this significant undertaking. A collection of islands in the Atlantic are claimed by Canada as part of New Brunswick, but the United States says they are part of Maine. Canada built a lighthouse on one of the islands since they believed it was theirs in the first place. In the meantime, the United States, which also claims sovereignty over the islands, decides to disregard the lighthouse's presence. This conflict, which mostly affects tourists interested in puffins and fishermen after lobsters, is not a big deal. But before any oil is found beneath the lighthouse, which may aggravate the situation, one must hope for a settlement. There are several quite strange locations, even in the undisputed area, such the strange border tick that extends uphill into Canada. It gets even more strange when you enlarge on it on the map, since the border encloses a part of Canada before returning to the United States, passing through a lake rather than following the contour of solid land. About 100 Americans live in this region, which is a perfect illustration of how border anomalies arise. A chart showing the boundaries was necessary in 1783 during talks between the Americans and the British, who were in charge of future Canada. Though very comprehensive on the East Coast, the available map at the time became increasingly imprecise as it moved further west. The boundary between what would eventually become Minnesota and Manitoba was the region in discussion. Unfortunately, this area was obscured by an insert on the map, so the Americans and British were essentially blind to it. They made an informed assumption that the border would start at a specific lake's northwest corner and go horizontally until it met the Mississippi River, somewhere. The border is unknown because the Mississippi River stops short of that line, making the somewhere a bit of a stretch. They were certain they were about to come up with a fantastic solution, but it took 35 years of talks before the famous 49th parallel was officially recognized as the border. After the British beat the French in the French and Indian War in the 18th century, they went on to take control of New Brunswick. As a result, the border between Maine and New Brunswick became more fixed and distinct. This was codified at the Treaty of Paris in 1763, but there were a few snags along the way. Let's fast forward to the Aroostook War in the 19th century. It wasn't a full-fledged conflict, but it did draw a lot of attention to the border area. The United States and Britain, which ruled Canada, were forced to eventually sit down and work things out as a result of the conflicts and battles that occurred during this time. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842 was the final outcome. The official border was established by this treaty, and it is currently known as the 49th parallel. Although it was somewhat of a compromise, the border problems were resolved. Thus, in a sense, the Aroostook War forced both parties to find a permanent solution. Though this entire process was somewhat of a roller coaster, in the end, the confusion that had existed for years was reduced, and Maine and New Brunswick's boundary became more firmly defined. Thus, in an odd sense, these historical battles contributed to the somewhat obvious demarcation of the peculiar US-Canada border. The boundary problem seemed to go on forever because of a high-altitude lake whose uneven shape caused the northwesterly point to fluctuate unpredictably. This necessitated adjusting the border, which produced an odd arrangement. You can't just draw a straight line, either. Thank goodness, Vancouver Island avoided splitting, and oddities such as Point Roberts and the remote Canadian island still exist. These distinct border scenarios, delineated by no-touch zones, highlight the significance of distinct border markers separating neighboring countries.